Western industrial democracies. I mean, and it is driven by a much more consumer-oriented society, a more competitive consumer-oriented society. Although I somewhat question at times this idea of competitiveness as well. When we see Walmarts moving into every town and city in our province, and the impact of that which is the largest multinational corporation on the face of this earth, coming into an area like Truro or an area like Port Hawkesbury, and what those large box stores do, and a store like Walmart does, Mr. Speaker, and it's well documented, what they do is they suck the dollars out of the local economy and they transport them into the shareholders outside of this country, and they leave the small retailer in this province and wherever they locate at a distinct disadvantage, Mr. Speaker. And let's not kid ourselves about who has driven the whole debate on Sunday shopping in this province. Quite often it is the large box stores, it is the big multinationals, it is the interests that are not the interests of the local business person. They are not the interests of the local economy. And you know, Mr. Speaker, you have to ask yourself, how in the world is it possible for anybody to turn this tide back and turn it around, Mr. Speaker? So I think, you know, we have to be honest here, and we have to put that out as part of the debate. And I'm hoping that when the public have an opportunity to come and comment on Sunday shopping and the Sunday shopping legislation, that we will hear from some people, perhaps, who have some expertise with respect to the larger interests that have driven this issue and this agenda. Now, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the third party also made some comments about whether or not the members of the NDP, the NDP caucus, knew what our position was on Sunday shopping. And Mr. Speaker, it's true, you know, we just had an election. We ran on a 7-point platform of commitments that we were offering to Nova Scotians, and Sunday shopping wasn't on that list. And Mr. Speaker, it wasn't on that list for a reason. It wasn't on that list because Sunday shopping is not a priority for the NDP caucus. And Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you a little story. I knocked on a door, and a young woman answered the door, and I introduced myself. This is during the election, and her husband, her boyfriend, was there, and he said, "What are you going to do about Sunday shopping?" And I said to him, "Well, you know, this is our platform, and this is the things that we're running on." And he said, "I don't care about any of those things. I'm only interested in Sunday shopping." And I said to him, "Well, you know, frankly, Sunday shopping isn't one of our priorities. We're interested in seeing that the health care costs for seniors who have to go into a nursing home is covered. And so if I have a choice between, you know, getting to deal with Sunday shopping or the health care needs of seniors, then I'm going to deal with the health care needs of seniors. That's my priority. That's my party's priority. And that continues to be the case, Mr. Speaker. You know, we are interested in a variety of other things. Now, having said that, Mr. Speaker, we recognize, and I recognize, that Sunday shopping is on the government's agenda. It is something that the government feels is important. It is a commitment they made. And the government won more seats than we did, so they get to decide on what the agenda, the legislative agenda will be in this House, Mr. Speaker. And it's our job here in the opposition to try to improve legislation that the government brings forward. And it's our job here in the legislature also to represent our constituents and also to point out, get all of the information out, all of the different viewpoints out, and try to see if you can arrive at something that's workable for, as workable as possible for a great number of people. So given that is the reality, we focus very much, Mr. Speaker, on the workers that are going to be impacted by Sunday shopping. And as I said, there are specific questions we would have around what is the impact, what is the implication of Sunday shopping on working people, and I have raised the issue of childcare. Mr. Speaker, the leader of my party had an opportunity to speak to the issue of legislation as it pertains to the Constitution and the constitutionality, I guess, of legislation. He's a lawyer. I'm not. I'm not going to speak to this particular issue, although I understand that it's a matter that certainly the government and the government's lawyers will be looking at or probably have looked at. But, Mr. Speaker, there are many practical issues that we have to look at. I think one of the issues we need to look at is how do you ensure that workers who will have to work on Sunday as a result of this legislation, how do you ensure that they get adequate time off for their family and that they aren't sucked into a vortex of worsening labor conditions? As I said earlier, the Economic Council of Canada, when it did its large study on this sector, pointed out that it is the retail sector that tends to have the most insecurity, the lowest wages, the fewest benefits, and in many cases, the lack of due process for workers if they're in situations that are not favorable. So I guess what we could do, Mr. Speaker, is we could introduce Sunday shopping legislation, but we could also strengthen our labor standards legislation to provide more protections and better protections for workers who are left in a situation where they're vulnerable as a result of a more competitive and a more consumerist society, which is the reality. I think that we do have certainly a more consumerist society. Mr. Speaker, there are probably many other aspects of this bill that could be discussed, but I think at this time I have addressed some of the concerns that I have. I think that as the process unfolds, and we will see probably many groups and organizations come before the Law Amendments Committee to talk to us about their views and how this legislation will impact their particular segment of the labor market. We'll probably also have more specific information on various aspects of the bill, Mr. Speaker, and how it would affect different groups. And hopefully we will be assisted in that process with ways that we could improve the legislation. And I know the government House leader is probably open to seeing this legislation improved in the best way that we can do for Nova Scotians. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat. Thank you.
We'll resume debate with the honourable member from Victoria, the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the House to give the position that our caucus has taken on Sunday shopping. The Liberal caucus has taken a clear position on providing Nova Scotians with shopping each day of the week, Mr. Speaker, as well as providing retailers with the choice to open their shops every day. This position has been maintained consistently by our caucus. I campaigned with this in mind, met very, very little opposition to that during the campaign. Shops should be permitted to open after noon on Sunday, and yet retailers should not be forced to open on Sunday. It should be a business decision. They should be allowed their decision to open or not. And I always felt that this is not a government decision, but it should be a business decision. In today's society, where it requires two people to work, I see no reason why shops can't open on Sunday. The Honourable Jamie Muir, I understand, our Honourable Speaker Murray Scott, and the Honourable Ernie Fage, I understand, were three of the members of the government who campaigned with Sunday shopping in mind. Workers will be protected against working 7 days straight. That's present workers and new workers, Mr. Speaker. And I also see this as a good opportunity for students to get them to receive employment on the weekend or on a Sunday. It's a chance for them to make some hard-earned, needed dollars. And no one would be forced to work on Sunday. Legislation would prevent that. Religious beliefs must be respected. And what about those people who, on Sunday, is not their day of worship, Mr. Speaker?
Order.
Yes.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member from Victoria, the Lakes indicated that during the last election campaign I went around touting Sunday shopping, and Mr. Speaker, that certainly was not the case. My constituents, as I think everybody knows, like everybody else's, are very mixed on this thing, and I did articulate the position that our caucus had taken, but as going around promoting Sunday shopping, now I know there are members of our caucus who have a different opinion, but I just wanted to clarify that for the honourable member. He may have me confused with somebody else. I don't know.
Thank you. That was not a point of order, but a difference in opinions, and we'll resume debate with member for Victoria, the Lakes. And I'll remind the member when he's referring to members to refer to their constituencies, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I respect the honourable member's explanation for that and accept it. Mr. Speaker, I was saying that the religious beliefs are to be respected also. And as I said, what about those people on Sunday that Sunday is not their day of worship? And that's why I repeat that religious beliefs will and should be respected. Mr. Speaker, the Hotel Association of Nova Scotia is in favour of Sunday shopping, large business. Polls show that the majority of Nova Scotians want it. I myself have visited the Sunnyside Mall out in Bedford on numerous occasions and found it to be basically packed with Sunday shoppers. The Nova Scotia tourism industry expects that it loses $24 million by not having businesses open on Sunday. That, Mr. Speaker, is a great loss to the province. Tourists on cruise ships that dock in Halifax and Sydney on Sunday, they find that the shops are closed. Why is that? When every other port of call, they're open. The Metro Halifax Chamber of Commerce has also added a voice in calling for stores to be open on Sunday. another large organization with a lot of smart business people. Nova Scotia businesses are losing money to neighboring provinces. It's disparaging for businesses to see that their living is driving by their door on a Sunday because their shops are closed, and here's people spending dollars in another province. Sunday shopping should be a question of choice for individuals, not for government. I stand here to be corrected, but I must repeat certain portions of my presentation to emphasize the fact. The present government admitted that during polls, Nova Scotians want this choice. Let businesses decide if they should be open on Sunday or not. The marketplace will determine who opens and who doesn't. If a business opens and makes money, they'll probably stay open. If they don't, they won't. Simple as that. We're not reinventing the wheel here, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal caucus was the first to side with the majority of Nova Scotians who want stores open on Sunday. As I said, we campaigned on this, I did myself, and received very little opposition. The protection of employees who don't want to work on Sundays will be secure, absolutely. We'll guarantee this in legislation when the bill finds its way to law amendments. The Liberal caucus believes in ensuring that workers have adequate time off to spend with their families, and why shouldn't they? We are the only jurisdiction in all of North America not to have Sunday shopping in some form or another. Can't we even keep up with the North American continent, even if we are last? Mr. Speaker, the government has flip-flopped on the issue, stating that they wouldn't revisit this issue until 2005. It took an election period for the Conservative Party to suggest that they would review it, finally bring in a 6-week trial period at the end of this year prior to Christmas, and then holding a plebiscite in the fall of 2004. This coinciding with the municipal elections, and I'll add some thoughts on that, Mr. Speaker, before the end of my presentation. This is a $21 million question for our economy, as well as a question for 300 full-time jobs in Nova Scotia. Workers in the retail will need to be protected, as well as protected with appropriate regulation advantages, like I said. People have a choice, shop on Sunday or not. It could be advantageous for busy families, shift workers. Mr. Speaker, myself, I know there's times that it would be convenient. I'd rather have the convenience of shopping in Nova Scotia on a Sunday than to see our business going across the border into New Brunswick. It's part of Nova Scotia's progression without forsaking the quality of life in the province. Tie-ins. The tourism industry of Nova Scotia, as I said, estimates 300 jobs, $26 million in revenue. That would be generated if we move ahead as we should. This creates an equal playing field for places like Amherst versus other provinces. Positive economic results will result for the economy. People will have an option. It's the choice of the general public and visitors using business facilities to shop when they want, where they want, 7 days a week, Mr. Speaker. The government has declared its intent to allow for Sunday shopping between 1 and 6 on November the 16th through December the 21st. We, Mr. Speaker, propose an amendment to strike Clause 3A, Part 1A and B, which would permit the Act to allow Sunday shopping year-round without legislating restrictions on Sunday shopping to the 6 weeks before Christmas or as determined by a plebiscite. The Liberal caucus wants to strike a plebiscite, altogether allowing the Governor and Council to make regulations with respect to Sunday shopping outright. The government is elected to make decisions, Mr. Speaker, at least some decisions, rather than continue to download everything to municipalities, for example, like the smoking issue. When I was in municipal politics, we made a decision. We banned smoking outright, 100% stayed with it. Other municipalities eventually followed suit. Mr. Speaker, this Act currently discriminates against certain businesses as it permits restaurants, markets, movie theaters to open on Sunday, and at the same time disallowing certain businesses not to open. Mr. Speaker, the Act also violates religious freedom by not allowing certain religious groups to open on Sunday, a day which may not be necessarily the group's Sabbath day. In a free enterprise system, the business owner-operator should have the ability to set his or her hours of operation. The government should not have the right to set the hours for some businesses and allow loopholes to make it necessary that other businesses can open. Mr. Speaker, the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities President Don Zwicker stated that municipal leaders are opposed to holding a plebiscite on this question as part of the municipal elections. Regulating Sunday shopping is a provincial responsibility and does not belong on the municipal agenda. And I, for one, after having spent 12 years in municipal politics, Mr. Speaker, will know exactly what's going to happen in the fall of 2004. Every municipal councillor, every candidate going door to door is going to be asked, what's your view on Sunday shopping? And they can win or lose their election on their answer when it really isn't their business to be involved in that. It's provincial government's decision to make that for them. We always seem to be deferring something to somebody else. Downloading, we've heard for years. Now we're downloading the decision, have the plebiscite during the municipal elections. Let the people decide. See what comes out of that, and then we'll make a decision. Well, Mr. Speaker, I disagree with that. Let's make the decision here and now. Show our some accountability, show our credibility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there used to be legislation forbidding fishers to fish on Sunday. It had to be done away with. If fishers couldn't fish on Saturday because of bad weather, then they needed to go on Sunday. It was felt it had to be changed, and it was. Most fishers still don't fish on Sundays. A close friend of mine, Councillor Robert McClellan from Bay St. Lawrence, my dearest and closest friend, fished for crabs on Sunday, probably within the last month and a half. The first and only time in 5 years he fished on a Sunday out of sheer necessity because there was 10 straight days of bad weather. He set the traps, and you couldn't get your boat away from the dock for 10 full days after that. He was forced to fish on Sunday to just set the gear and get it straight so that he could go out again on Monday and fish. And that was his first and only time, and he has yet to go back out on Sunday again. But what it does, Mr. Speaker, by removing the option that not allowing them to fish on Sunday, they have that option. If it's necessary, they can without going out and breaking the law. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about working on Sunday. When I worked with Marine Atlantic back in the 60s, and it hasn't changed, Marine Atlantic ferries sail every day with a full crew, Sundays included. Our former, and I emphasize our former steel plant and coal miners worked on Sunday. Fish plants in my riding worked on Sunday. Hospitals work and are open on Sunday. Corner stores are open on Sunday. Drug stores are open on Sunday. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on and on and on. I hate repetition, but it's true. The world works on Sunday, so why not Nova Scotia? And let me make it perfectly clear. We, the Liberal Party, are first and foremost on the side of the protection of the workers. We'll guarantee that in legislation. Present and future workers, Mr. Speaker. And if that's not upheld, this is where the Department of Labour will come into effect. We're on the side of the workers, Mr. Speaker, and we are absolutely on the side of Sunday shopping. We will ensure Sunday shopping as well as we will ensure protection for the workers, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I want to thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have a few moments to speak on. Well, thank you, the member from Eastern Shore, for his applause. His smattering of applause. I appreciate it.
Muted applause.
I want to take a few minutes to talk about this bill, Bill number 2. Must be something about the chair with the words "few minutes," I think. But I want to talk about Sunday shopping, because it is something that I think we all as elected officials heard on the doorstep. I must be honest, it wasn't the main issue. It wasn't the first issue on people's lips. It did come up. Not as often as healthcare, not as often as education in my riding, whether it was a new high school or crumbling infrastructure in elementary schools in Cole Harbour, or lack of resource teachers. Those things all came up a lot more than Sunday shopping, Mr. Speaker. I almost found sometimes that people would raise Sunday shopping if they felt you come to the door and knock on their door and you would say, I'm here to talk to you. Do you have any concerns or questions you want to talk about? And most of the time, when they had nothing else to think about, maybe this would come up. And that wasn't that often, but it would come up. And, our party always had a clear position. It is inevitable that Sunday shopping will happen in Nova Scotia. That's something we said during the election, something we said before the election, and I can say it here on the record, and I'm sure our leader espoused a similar position when he spoke. Mr. Speaker, it's inevitable that this will happen. And I can look at some of the reasons why it is inevitable. There are already constitutional challenges in other provinces that resulted in certain legislation being defeated when it was an attempt to try and allow closing on Sundays, at least limited closing on Sundays. You have in Nova Scotia native reserves that are under federal jurisdiction. They don't come under provincial jurisdiction, who are attempting to open facilities on Sundays. I don't know if it's in the member from Truro-Bible Hills riding, the Power Centre, that sort of thing, Mr. Speaker, but they obviously are moving towards that. You have the airport that has announced that in fact, there was a piece in the paper yesterday, fittingly on a Sunday, I guess, because I figure that's where their main audience is. They want to actually, because you see these people who actually sit around the airport watching planes take off and land. I must admit, it's not something that I'm that fascinated by, but they're the people who actually watch planes take off and land. Right? You see them over on the Goffs Road. That would be in the beautiful Musquodoboit Valley. And they see the planes land, and you see the planes take off. And I guess it's something that the member from Colchester Musquodoboit Valley would know what I mean. And I believe that's the riding, that's Goffs Road to be his riding. But people sit out there. I used to see it in Toronto too, Mr. Speaker. You would see people who would be parked along the 427, Highway 427, and they'd be watching the planes land, and they're fascinated by it. I suppose in England they do train spotting. In Canada it must be plane spotting, because people sort of watch this. But anyway, point is that the Halifax International Airport, now that it's a privately run agency, is attempting to open up shops and stores and bars and coffee shops so people can come and watch the planes land and take off. And they're going to try and make money off of this, including Sundays. It's true. Including on Sundays. So they're going to open on Sundays because they know they have a loophole. Under federal jurisdiction, there is no rule against Sunday shopping. They can open. And so they're going to do it as well. So now we have native reserves. We have the airport. I suppose the train station can do it as well if they wanted to. I guess, they're under federal jurisdiction. And then on top of that, you have those that, and I'll get into more detail, but you have those that have, who've had lawyers with sharp pencils, I guess, and have analyzed the law and have decided that they can drive a truck through the current legislation. And as a result,
Pete's Fatigue truck.
well, if you ever wanted to go down to Bedford at the corner of the Bedford Highway and Dartmouth Road on any given Sunday, it's packed. It's hard to find a parking spot, and as a result, you end up having a real problem trying to get. But that's because there's a lot of people in this province that want Sunday shopping. There's no doubt about that. And I think the polls show that. The question is, Mr. Speaker, and I think what our party has always said, it is going to be inevitable. But are we going to open this up? And I heard the member from Victoria the Lakes say people want to shop, each day, every day. Well, if you want to shop every day, you have to work every day. And I know the member from Victoria the Lakes, I'll give him credit. He pointed out the steel plant had to work on Sundays when it was open. The coal mines were open, and they had to open on Sundays. Marine Atlantic operated on Sundays. Hospitals are open on Sundays. Fire stations are open on Sundays. They all have union contracts. They have collective agreements. And they don't work 7 days a week, obviously, except in very extreme circumstances, like in the last little while. But generally speaking, they get time off in lieu of working on Sunday. Some even get time and a half probably for having to work a Sunday in certain circumstances. Double time, triple time in certain days on holidays. So the point is that they have the opportunity to take a day off in lieu of Sunday if they have to work Sunday. And they don't work every Sunday. They work some Sundays. They don't work other Sundays. But the collective agreement and democratization in the workplace, Mr. Speaker, has resulted in them having rights. And if the business has to be open on a Sunday, they have alternative means of assuring they either get paid appropriately for that, or they have days off in return. Maybe it's a Monday and Tuesday. And we all know in a lot of places in public services, police, fire, hospitals, you may work 2 days. I think it's usually 4 days on, 4 days off for police and hospitals. So they do have time off. Our worry is that Sunday shopping alone will result in workers having to work 7 days a week. And not only workers, but those workers that have the least amount of rights. Most likely they're non-unionized. They may be younger. They may be workers. They could be, as my colleague from Halifax Indian pointed out, predominantly women in the retail trade, single mothers in many cases. We are not going to allow them to be able to work on Sundays and not allow them to have certain rights in return. Certain rights to ensure that if they don't want to work on a Sunday, they have the right to refuse. If they want time off in lieu on a Monday or Tuesday, if not a Sunday, they should have that right. But we don't have that in this province. And if we're moving towards Sunday shopping, which is what Bill number 2 is at least tentatively, baby step-wise, moving in that direction until the plebiscite, Mr. Speaker, we should ensure that these workers have the protection they need to ensure that their lives, they have some control over their lives on Sundays. This is a change in the way we operate in this province, without a doubt. The member from Victoria the Lakes said we're the last ones in North America, or at least the last ones in the US and Canada, I presume, that do this. But, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't mean we have to do it the same way they do. Just because North Carolina and South Carolina have right-to-work legislation that bans unionization doesn't mean we have to do it. Just because other provinces may not provide for the right to refuse to work on Sundays if you don't want to doesn't mean we don't have to put it in. In fact, I would argue we have a duty, not only a right, but a duty incumbent upon us in this House to say, if we're the last jurisdiction in North America, in the US and Canada, actually bring in some form of Sunday shopping, then we are wiser than the others, because the first one who did it was the first place, and they didn't have other examples to go by. We have 50 state examples, we have 9 provincial examples, and presumably some territorial examples as well, Mr. Speaker, that allow us to take a look at what those provinces, what those states, what those territories have done, and we have a responsibility to make sure our law is better because we can learn from their mistakes. And in return, we can ensure workers have rights that they don't have in other places, Mr. Speaker. It's that simple. It's not brain surgery, it's not rocket science, but it does involve us admitting that if we're going to do this, we must ensure workers are protected. And I want to get into some more of those details, but I want to talk a bit before that, if I can, about some of the history around this, because I think it's important to put on the record exactly where in Canada and in Nova Scotia we've been. I mean, obviously Sunday in North America, in Western Europe, Eastern Europe as well, I guess, in Christian societies considered the Sabbath, always was. It was the day in which people, time stood still. You did very little. In fact, there are still some religions that recognize you don't do anything on Sundays, some Christian sects. But, Mr. Speaker, obviously, as we become more productive, as society has become to the point where we need to have certain services on a 24-hour basis, we need to have certain goods sold on a 24-hour basis, or at least on a 7-day-a-week basis, Mr. Speaker, there's been a need for us to move away from that right. And this is one of the first challenges, by the way. In Canada, this was not debated. It was never debated that we would open on Sundays until 1982, when we brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When we brought in that charter, we changed Canada forever. It could be, we even saw that last Friday. Government after government in this province tried to limit the rights of certain workers under the Workers' Compensation Act. And it was only the Charter of Rights that was passed in 1982 that guaranteed the workers their rights and said the government cannot do that. It took 10 or 15 years to finally get that decision, but it's a landmark decision in the history of workers' compensation law in this province, in this country, and in insurance law in this country. And Mr. Speaker, the Charter of Rights allowed that to happen. Before that, people had to accept what the government did. In many cases, it was very paternalistic and an approach that we know what's best. Now, you can argue either way, that the Charter of Rights hasn't created a better world by ensuring we have Sunday shopping. I think many people could argue that one way or the other. But the fact is, the Charter of Rights has resulted in that, because before 1982, we didn't have Sunday shopping. Hospitals were open on Sundays, fire departments were open, police stations, but generally speaking, malls were not open. And someone who probably wanted to make a buck, realized that here's an opportunity for me to go to court and argue that the law that says I can't open on Sunday because it's a Christian holiday, it's the Sabbath, is unconstitutional because presumably the first person to challenge it was not Christian. Maybe they're Muslim, maybe they were Jewish, maybe they had no religion. But Mr. Speaker, they came forward and said, I'm challenging this law because you're violating my rights. And once the door was open, you're not going to shut it again. And that's what happened, and we had many people, many provinces that moved in that direction. Now, Nova Scotia didn't. In some ways, we are the last province to admit that maybe Sunday shopping is something that's inevitable. And we've held on for a long time, Mr. Speaker. Other provinces moved in this direction. I think in Ontario, they moved in 1990 or 91. It would have been shortly after the government was elected in September of 1990. They moved towards Sunday shopping, and they put in place certain protections for workers, as did other provinces. I don't think they were the first. They fought for a while as well, but eventually they moved in that direction. Well, Mr. Speaker, there's a need to ensure that in Nova Scotia we have some of those protections as well. So, with the Charter of Rights, the Sabbath day as an automatic day in which everything must close ended. Now, can I say, in the past 15, 20 years since the Charter came in, other things have changed as well in this province. I mean, even with a law that says you can't open on Sundays, there are certain things that are open. The member from Victoria the Lakes pointed out movie theaters. You know, how many times on the doorstep were people who oppose Sunday or for Sunday shopping point out, you can gamble in a casino, you can buy drinks in a bar, right? You can buy cigarettes at a corner store, but you can take your children to the bar, that's right. But you can't buy groceries, can't buy school supplies in some cases in a decent store. And Mr. Speaker, those are the problems that we face with this law. It's a sort of double standard, or triple standard in some cases, that we have in this province. That we allow some things to open, we don't allow others. I don't deny we need some consistency in how we're going to do this. But at the same time, in the last 20 years, Mr. Speaker, we have moved from a system where very little was open on Sundays to many things in many parts of the country being open on Sundays. So what happened after the Charter? Clearly, you couldn't have a law that says Sunday is the Lord's Day. In fact, I think they used to be called the Lord's Day Act. It used to be the Lord Day Act. It was, and I don't think that referred to the Premier of New Brunswick. I assume that referred to someone else. But the fact is, those laws were in place specifically for Christian reasons. They had to change that. Well, in some respects, what they probably did at the time would have done some word search in the document and found anything that had any sort of Christian reference or reference to the Lord's Day or the Sabbath taken out, replacing it with the word uniform. Because what Nova Scotia ended up doing was called the Uniform Closing Day Act, or the Retail Business Closing Day Act. There's different names for it. But the concept is telling the court, well, we're not doing it for religious reasons. It just happens to be Sunday because traditionally, in Christian society, which we're predominantly one, we never had Sundays as a day. So we're going to keep that as the day. It won't be for religious reasons now. It's more cultural and historic reasons that this happens to be the day, but it will still be the day in which almost everything is closed. And that's what happened. We passed a law. I'm not sure when it was passed. 85? 1989. Revised statutes, probably passed before that. But the fact is that we passed a law that just recognized the fact that it's a uniform day of closing. Now, the problem is you can drive a truck through that law. I'm not just talking about the native reserves or the airports, but there are a lot of other things, and I'll get to that in a minute as well. But, Mr. Speaker, the problem is the Uniform Closing Day Act is that it's still, first of all, the language is any law you draft that tries to halt progress, some would argue, to try and stop Sunday shopping from occurring, which is what was attempted in the 80s, Mr. Speaker, in this province. They knew they couldn't do it under the Sabbath Day Act anymore, the Lord's Day Act. They had to do it under something else, and they did it, Mr. Speaker, under something they just called a Uniform Closing Day Act or Retail Business Closing Day Act. Well, Mr. Speaker, the result was imperfect language. For example, some of the exceptions are based on space, and someone was saying earlier 2,700 square feet, and I always remember, the member from Dartmouth North, I remember 10 years ago, it used to be a Capital store in Dartmouth North. It used to be at the corner of Albro Lake and Victoria Road, and it used to be open, and I thought, geez, this is a grocery store. Why is it open? When I first came back from Toronto, it was pointed out to me that it probably just fit within the number of square feet that it needed in order to stay open. And I tell you, it was convenient. I won't deny that. And I was sad to see it close. That must be 5 or 6 years ago now. It must have closed, or even before that. But the fact is that you had a situation where that store was able to find the fine line. Once you set a limit, and of course we talk about the business in Bedford, I don't need to give its name necessarily, But that business in Bedford works on the sense, it's huge, but it works on the sense that it's not one store, just happens to have very thin walls, I guess. It has several stores. There's the store for fish, there's the store for meat, there's the store for groceries, there's the store for bakeries, magazines, yes. But they're all relatively small. They all fit within that. So they've created, some call them Chinese walls, or they've created these false walls to make a sense that they actually are different stores when in fact they are one store. And I'm actually surprised it hasn't caught on in other places. I'm surprised others haven't attempted to do it. I guess many of them thought that eventually we'll get to this point today where we're actually debating this law. And Mr. Speaker, but here's another one that I always thought was interesting when I read it a year ago when this issue started coming up again. And that was, I think in the Act it actually says there's an exception for video stores, video rental, and stores that sell and rent videotapes. And I find that interesting because I was joking, thinking, you know, a few years from now, if we don't amend this law, a few years from now, Mr. Speaker, video cassettes are going to be obsolete. Everyone will be using DVDs. So technically speaking, if someone has a store where they're renting DVDs and not videos, according to that law, they're violating the law. It is a fine point, and it's one I think that has to be made, that the law as it currently stands has very peculiar exceptions that were written in the time in which the law was passed in the 80s. And at the time, they probably thought that was progressive. Video stores were fairly new. This was something we wanted to capture. I'm sure they came forward at law amendments and argued for the exception. The fact is, times have changed. They've changed in a lot of ways, not only in the language for exceptions, but for the things that need to be accessible. And I should say, I guess, Mr. Speaker, from my perspective, I have a young family, and I was listening to the member from Halifax-Needham. You know, we're in a situation where, you know, we both work on a very active life. We have children who want to do things on Saturdays particularly, or we have things we have to do. And of course, there are obligations in this job or in my wife's work that result in us having to do a lot of things on Saturdays. And to say that we have to put on that list grocery shopping, of course, we do make time. We have to. We have no choice. But there are many people in my constituency, I know, Mr. Speaker, when I spoke to them, that said, why don't I have the choice to do it on Sunday? And by the way, I didn't see the sky falling yesterday when we opened stores. But clearly, we need to ensure that when it happens, we put in place those protections to make sure that workers have the ability to have some control over their own lives. And Mr. Speaker, that is what my constituents have told me. When I said to them, this is not necessarily about Sunday shopping, because Sunday shopping is inevitable. It's ensuring that workers, particularly those who are the most disenfranchised, those that have the least power, the least control over their own lives, have some ability to have some control. It's simple, really. It isn't that difficult. And given the fact that businesses, to a great extent, right now, don't have the benefit of Sunday shopping, for them to say, well, if we are going to get it, maybe we can do it based on ensuring we provide workers with those protections. You're still going to make as much money. Maybe you have to hire other people than the ones who are working the rest of the week. Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact is, I think they'd be willing to accept that. And quite frankly, with workers, we need to do it. Because these are the workers that have the least rights. We're talking about expanding a retail businesses where almost none of them are unionized. And we're in a situation where we need to ensure they're provided with support. Mr. Speaker, recent history has shown that in other provinces we've had situations occur. It's only a few years ago that New Brunswick moved in this direction. You recall that at some point the provincial government in New Brunswick, and I, having studied this as the critic, I realized that of the 9 provinces currently that have some form of Sunday shopping, I think 6 of them downloaded it on the municipalities. And I noted the member from Victoria Lakes saying there's no need to download anymore. He's right. But I found it interesting that of the 9 provinces so far in Canada that have some form of Sunday shopping, 6 of them place a burden on the municipalities to decide. They say that each municipality has to make that decision. And you saw in New Brunswick, that's how they did it. I think Moncton and then Dieppe and then Riverview, which are 3 separate municipalities, all had to decide. And I think even one of them decided not to have Sunday shopping. I'm not absolutely sure about that. But the fact is that they were given that choice. And now Fredericton has to make that decision, or Edmundston, or Miramichi City, or St. John, or Sussex, or Tracadie. They all have to make that decision as to whether they're going to open or not. But it's very interesting that it was introduced in February 2002 in Moncton. And it's interesting, according to Statistics Canada, they do a study of retail sales comparing 2002 to 2001. So for almost all of 2002, Mr. Speaker, Moncton would have had Sunday shopping, and of course it expanded somewhat quickly throughout then. We in Nova Scotia didn't have Sunday shopping. And between 2002 and 2001, there was a 5.4% increase in retail sales in Nova Scotia in 2002 without Sunday shopping. And in New Brunswick, where its major centers started having Sunday shopping, it only went up 3.2%. Now, I guess that some could argue means that we have a situation where opening on Sundays didn't result in more shopping. Didn't result in those people in Moncton going out and buying more, people in Fredericton, people in Miramichi City, they didn't go out and buy more. Some argue all you're doing is creating 6 days of revenue and spreading it over 7 days of expenses. Now, that's up to business to decide, I guess. That's why some won't open. Maybe that's why some will. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that New Brunswick's recent history is checkered at best with regard to how this has worked. They originally started, I believe, with a 6-month period from July to December. They used to be open. And then they asked for a full year one, and they got it from the municipal board there. Oh, and by the way, compared to the next year, 2003, 2002, again, we had no Sunday shopping here. In Nova Scotia, it went up 2.3% retail sales. In New Brunswick, where they had Sunday shopping, and it was even expanded more in that next year, 1.1% increase. So clearly, Sunday shopping is not a panacea for businesses who think they're going to make more money. It's not the answer. That's not the reason we should do this. And those businesses that are out there lobbying government to say, we need to open on Sundays because we need an opportunity to make more money, are probably either fooling themselves or are using false reasons for attempting to do this. Well, Mr. Speaker, all of that will result, I guess, in the end, in New Brunswick, much like in the insurance issue, is sort of ahead of us on this. But in the end, we'll have to see where it goes. PEI, I think, only has 6 weeks before Christmas. Maybe it's 8, but I think it's 6 weeks before Christmas, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, from that, you have, they probably have right now have the least amount of Sunday shopping with just those 6 weeks. And I know one of the proposals in this legislation is to have the people vote on if they accept that Sunday shopping should happen, which is the first question. The second question is, should it be all year long or the 6 weeks before Christmas? So we very well may end up with the same position as PEI. Again, presuming that that's when people are most likely to shop. It's when they're most likely to go out and need things because of their hectic schedules. And let's face it, before Christmas, and I know with kids, it's very, very hectic before Christmas. So these are some of the things that have happened in other provinces. I will say British Columbia, I think, was one of the first to come forward with a Uniform Business Closing Day Act, and it was challenged. I find it interesting that they came forward with one to reflect the changes from the charter, and it was challenged anyway. Presumably it was too constrictive, or some businesses felt they weren't allowed to open the way they wanted, and it was knocked down by the court. It was found unconstitutional as well. And one of the reasons I understand, and maybe the leader of the opposition raised this already, but one of the reasons I understand is something around identifying alternative Sabbath days. If this is really about avoiding religious reasoning for opening and closing on Sundays, and in this case in Nova Scotia, we've identified that we will allow some form of Sunday shopping, though it will still be restricted compared to other days, then alternatively you have to provide for those that aren't Christian the ability to open all day long on Sundays in return for having more restricted hours or no hours on their Sabbath, whether it's Friday if you're Muslim or Saturday if you're Jewish. Those are the two I know. There may be other. I believe that the members of the Eastern Orthodox churches celebrate Sunday as the Sabbath day as well. I think the Seventh-day Adventists, someone said maybe their day is Saturday. So there are others out there, and of course they're Christian, right? So I mean, there are others out there that may have a different day, and our legislation has to reflect that. If we are truly trying to do something that is trying to be secular, is trying to be non-religious, while still allowing people to shop, then we have to do this differently. And we didn't under the Retail Business Closing Day Act, and quite frankly, we could have been challenged, and some would argue we would have lost. It didn't happen in this province. But we're back here now, and I think we have a duty as legislators to make sure that this legislation is constitutional. And I've sat almost in this exact spot 4 years ago when we talked about Bill 90 and the Workers' Compensation Act, saying the exact same thing. Don't pass laws that are unconstitutional. but we did. And we buried the issue for 4 years, 4.5 years, and we're back at it again. So I guess my attitude is, don't do half a job when you can do the full job. Don't make a mess of something that you can fix now. And with regard to this, we have an opportunity to ensure that we provide those protection for workers. We provide a legally sound legislation that cannot be constitutionally challenged. Because someday, somewhere, someone will do it. We were lucky enough in the last 15 years or so to avoid it. Under the current legislation, we need an opportunity to do it now. And of course, I may suggest to you that there are many people out there that have sort of bitten their tongue and have said, no, we're not going to do anything about this right now. We'll wait and see how the plebiscite goes. If this plebiscite votes against Sunday shopping, I suspect there'll be a long line of businesses lining up in the courts the next Monday ready to challenge this law and say it is unconstitutional. Because it is inevitable, it will happen, and we as Nova Scotians have to be prepared to reflect on that fact while still protecting the workers of Nova Scotia. Now, the plebiscite itself is interesting, Mr. Speaker, because the plebiscite, and I think someone said we've only had 2 provincial plebiscites in the history of Nova Scotia, and I stand to be corrected on that. One was in the 1920s, maybe over prohibition, and the other one was in the 1880s over something else. So I hope that this plebiscite doesn't have the same historic footnote that a plebiscite on prohibition would have had in the 1920s. But it is a very unusual way to do this, very unusual. Nova Scotia does not have a history of plebiscites. This isn't the United States, particularly California, where they have propositions every election. We do it differently in the Westminster system of law, and plebiscites are fairly unusual. Now, some of those provinces out west, like British Columbia and Alberta, have more of a tendency to want to do this. But again, we happen to be the oldest legislature in the former British Empire. We have one of the earliest forms of responsible government in the history of the world, of democratically elected and responsible government, and we are very close to the system that they have in the United Kingdom, of a Westminster system. Mr. Speaker, as a result, we haven't used plebiscites that often, 2, since Confederation. Well, Mr. Speaker, why are we doing it on this issue? Well, the crass political answer is the party across the way that's the government couldn't get consensus any other way. They had to promise some of their rural backbenchers that they would have a vote in order to ensure that they would buy into this agreement. It's a compromise that's going to cost us money. It's going to do it's going to throw a monkey wrench in the works of the municipal elections, as the member from Victoria Lakes pointed out. Well, Mr. Speaker, is that the right way for us to legislate law? Is that leadership? I would argue not. But that's what we've been produced with. And I want to make it clear to those who may be listening or reading Hansard that this may be a minority government. And there may be more members sitting on this side of the House than that side of the House. But the only laws we can vote on are the ones that this government call for a vote. And the only one they're probably going to call for a vote with regard to Sunday shopping is their bill. And if they want plebiscite, that's what we have to vote on. We don't have any choice. We can produce our own bill. The Liberal Party can produce their own bill, Mr. Speaker. But if the government doesn't want to vote on it, there's not going to be a vote. So we're stuck with what their agenda is. We can tinker with it. We can fine-tune it when we go to law amendments. We can hear from the people of Nova Scotia as to what they think. But in the end, it's the Tories who set the agenda. And indeed, if we were to amend the bill to eliminate plebiscites, I suspect they just won't call the bill. They will say that's not what they agreed to, and the bill will die on the floor of this House. So we're in a situation where, to make it clear, though it's a minority government, the government itself addresses the agenda and calls the bills that will be voted on. We have some more influence with regard to changing them, but generally speaking, what is called for a vote, what bills are introduced and called, is that of the government House Leader and the Progressive Conservative Party, which is in government. And that's the way it is. And I think it's important for people in Nova Scotia to understand that minority governments are still a government that can control the agenda of the House to a great extent. I would say we have some more rights on the opposition side. We have some more ability to try and influence a government, but that does not result in us having the ability to draw up our own law and call it for debate, have it voted on, passed, and force the government to impose it. It's not the way it works, and I think Nova Scotians need to understand that. I should also say that in Nova Scotia, in Ontario, in 1990, I mentioned they brought in Sunday shopping. Well, under that law, Mr. Speaker, they put in place certain protections for workers, rights to refuse work. They also put in place certain timelines. And I don't know if it's 12 to 6 or 1 to 6, but they have a certain time in which stores are open. Again, even though it's supposed to be a secular law, presumably they open at noon because people want to go to church Sunday mornings. So that is something that's been put into that law, and I believe it's being put into this one. And that law was challenged, and it was upheld. So those who believe that you can't have restrictions on Sunday shopping are probably wrong, according to the courts, but that doesn't mean we can't have protection of workers as part of whatever law we put in, Mr. Speaker. And I want to talk about worker protection, because this law is not just amendments to the Retail Business Uniform Closing Day Act. It is also amendments to the Labor Standards Code. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to talk about the Labor Standards Code. Mr. Speaker, in Canada, I would argue Nova Scotia is the Mississippi of Canada. We are a province with horrible legislation for workers. Now, in the southern United States, they have incredibly antiquated, undemocratic, and I would argue horrible laws that are in place to prevent workers from having almost any rights. In Canada, we happen to be a little more progressive, though in Nova Scotia, not by much. We live in a province where overtime is almost unheard of, overtime pay. Overtime pay in most places in the civilized world is based on 1.5 times of your hourly wage. So that if you work a certain number of hours a week, over and above that, if you work and you're making $10 an hour, you get $15 an hour pay. 1.5 times your hourly wage. In Nova Scotia, we base it on 1.5 times the minimum wage, which has slowly progressed to $6 an hour, so that if you make anything over $9 an hour in Nova Scotia as a wage, overtime is irrelevant. Overtime pay is irrelevant. You're paid your hourly wage. We if I, for example, work 50 hours, let's say 58 hours for sake of argument, because in Nova Scotia, the other problem is in Nova Scotia, we have to work 48 hours a week. Our work week is 48 hours. So a lot of Nova Scotians don't know, because they may have progressive employers or they're in a union or contract. Mr. Speaker, they don't know that we actually don't have a 40-hour work week in this province. We have a 48-hour work week. Now, on top of that, if you work above 48 hours, so I'll say 58 hours, and you make $10 an hour. Those extra 10 hours, in most jurisdictions in Canada, you would be making, as I said, $10 an hour at 1.5 times for 10 hours would be $15 an hour for 10 hours, which would be an extra $150 for those 10 hours work in that week. Mr. Speaker, in this province, if you make $10 an hour and you work those 10 hours over and above the 48 hours, you actually make $10 an hour for those 10 hours, because under our system, you are guaranteed pay at 1.5 times the minimum wage. That's $6 an hour for minimum wage. 1.5 times is 9 hours. Well, you're already making 10 hours. For some reason, you're considered affluent, I guess, at $10 an hour. So those people don't get any extra money. Now, if they happen to work in a place where it's 40-hour work week for 58 hours at 1.5 times the pay, they'd actually make a lot more money than they would be here. Who benefits from that? Well, not the retail workers, not the workers who aren't unionized, not the workers without a benevolent employer who see the benefit in paying their workers a decent wage when they work overtime. No, the people who benefit are employers, Mr. Speaker, who are able to save those nickels and dimes. When you have 10 employers or 20 or 30 or 40 or 200 or 1,000, it adds up. It adds up. And I understand we all have to make a living, but what we're talking about with regard to the issue of minimum overtime at a decent salary, at 1.5 times your hourly wage, Mr. Speaker, is not putting us out on the limb. It's not making us the most progressive province in the country. Quite frankly, it's making our labor standards meet the 20th century. This has been standard law in this country for 40 years, and our province still hasn't passed it. And how does this government rationalize coming forward with the Labor Standards Code amendments that touch on Sunday shopping, that quite frankly would put in certain provisions for Sunday shopping, when in fact they've ignored the need for all workers in this province to have a minimum standard of what they can obtain. Well, Mr. Speaker, this province has done that. It's introduced legislation, and it's ignored the rights of a lot of workers. Now, before I get into too much more detail about those parts of the Labor Standards Code, I want to talk about the parts that are in this bill. This bill talks about, Mr. Speaker, the right to refuse work. Now, let me start by saying that we were glad as an opposition party to be asked to provide some input with regard to those worker protection provisions. I think I can put that on the record. We provided a list of what we wanted to see. We wanted to see legislation that allowed workers who didn't want to work on Sundays to refuse to work, and all they had to give was 48 hours notice in order to get that. We wanted to see similar to the Occupational Health and Safety Officers under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Nova Scotia, Madam Speaker, we wanted to see legislation that allowed the inspectors, when someone did refuse to work, they'd be able to get their job back. And I'll get into more detail on that in a minute. And we wanted to see a guarantee where you had 10 or more employees in your business that a worker would have the right to 48 hours off in a row. Hopefully on a Sunday, as it is written in Saskatchewan, but at least 48 hours off. So we don't have people working 7 days a week. If they can't get the Sunday off, maybe it's Monday and Tuesday, or Wednesday and Thursday, or Friday and Saturday. But the fact is, they'd be guaranteed 2 days off in a row, a rest period. How radical. Well, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, some of the things, I want to get into more details about the refusal. So, here's the way it works, and I'm going to use an analogy from the Occupational Health and Safety Act under Westray, because it's important. Because in Nova Scotia in the mid-90s, we introduced a new Occupational Health and Safety Act that gave more teeth to inspectors. Why? Well, because under Westray, people had the right to refuse work. People had the right to refuse unsafe work. And many people after Westray that did the investigation, whether it be the Department of Labor, whether it be the Richards Inquirer, whether it be during the prosecution, it came out, Madam Speaker, that those workers would not refuse to work. And people would say, you had the right. The right was right there. And they would say, yeah, but if I refused to work, I'd be fired. And if I was fired, I had to go to the Labor Standards Tribunal and apply to get my job back, which takes 9 months to a year at that time. It may even be longer now. I don't know. 9 months to a year in order to get your job back. Well, let's face it. If you're living in Pictou County and working at Westray at a mine, are you going to refuse to work and then wait a year to get your job back? And of course, EI doesn't necessarily pay you if you're fired. You have to argue that it was for health and safety reasons, which means you have to go to the EI tribunal, Employment Insurance Tribunal, you have to go to the Labor Standards Tribunal, and you could very easily be spending months upon months without any salary coming in. And if you're a worker with children and a family and dependents, what are you going to do? You're going to keep working. So in point of fact, the right to refuse unsafe work under the old Occupational Health and Safety Act was not a right at all, because workers weren't willing to take it because they knew they'd be fired. And if they were fired, they'd be without unemployment insurance. They would be without any right to get their job back. What did they do under the Occupational Health and Safety Act after that? Well, they decided the best thing is a right is only a right if you can get immediate reinstatement of your job. It was always there. You had the right to get your job back. Well, what normally happened is if you did refuse to work and you were fired and you applied under the Labor Standards Tribunal, Madam Speaker, sometime in that 9-month to 12-year period, the employer would come forward and offer you a severance package and ship you off. You'd take it because you needed the cash, because you weren't getting anywhere else. And maybe you'd move away and work at another mine. In the case of Westray, you'd work somewhere else. Well, Madam Speaker, the old line, I guess, is justice delayed is justice denied. And that works with regard to the workplace as well. So, the Occupational Health and Safety Act that was amended and provided in 1997 stated that inspectors under that legislation, if someone refused to work and was fired, the inspector could come in within 48 hours and reinstate that person right there. It also prevented the employer and the employee from getting into a long-term conflict. It'd be resolved, and it would be done with, and the person could go back to their job. We need the same provision if we're going to allow people to refuse to work on Sundays, because I know full well people will be fired. People will lose their jobs. And without the provision that the labor standards officers have the right to come in and reinstate those workers, we will not have a real right for workers. Now, some out there may argue, how do you do that? You have it now. We have an Occupational Health and Safety Act with inspectors that have the power to come in and reinstate workers. We can do the same for labor standards officers as well. It's that easy. As long as it doesn't violate the charter, this legislature can pass whatever it wants. Yes, there may be some employers who aren't happy, but if they want to open on Sundays, they've got to play by the rules that we set in this House. And one of the rules must be you cannot fire workers, and if you do, we will come in and give them their job back immediately. It will only take a few of those cases before the retail businesses start buzzing with the fact that they can't fire people for refusing to work on Sundays. And then that right will be a real right. Justice won't be denied. Justice will not be delayed. We'd also like to see something that provided 48 hours off in a row. They have it in Saskatchewan. We provided all of this to the government. They took some of it, and we appreciate what they took. Other things they did not take. Other things they felt was not important for them to put in there. And quite frankly, what we have as rights in this legislation are not good enough. They do not provide the workers of this province with a real right to refuse work, with a real provision to get their job back, or with any form of day of rest. As it stands right now, Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians could be working 7 days a week, and if they refuse to work on Sunday, they'll be tossed out on their ear pretty quickly. Madam Speaker, that's not good enough. That's not why we're here. That's not why we want to pass legislation. If we're going to have Sunday shopping, workers must have real protections, and it is not in this legislation. And I think the law amendments process will be very interesting to see how much money and how many people come forward to provide their input as to what they want to see. But the other part of this is we need legislation that will ensure, Madam Speaker, that we are no longer the Mississippi of Canada. We're no longer the right-to-work state, that we actually provide real provisions. And here are some of the ones that we'd like to see. If we're talking about really changing the labor standards code in this province, which is what has happened, this Minister of Labor, by introducing this legislation with the Minister of Justice, has opened the door for us to be able to provide real substantive change of the labor standards code. We see a small other, I think there's another piece of legislation in this House, I forget what bill number it is. It's a bill, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that deals with the issue of Bill 7, compassionate leave. And we all know this government has not taken, they'll try and claim that, well, aren't we a great government? Fact is, the federal government already passed changes to the Unemployment Insurance Act, the Employment Insurance Act, that provides for this leave. All they're doing is harmonizing so people here can take advantage of that right. They did the same thing a few years ago with regard to maternity leave. This government isn't leading. It's following, always following. And the fact is that this is an opportunity to lead, an opportunity to provide concrete change to legislation to ensure that workers in this province have rights they didn't have before, rights that almost every other worker in the industrialized world, in the civilized world has. For example, Madam Speaker, we have in this province, if you're not unionized, you have the right to 2 weeks vacation when you take a job.
20 years.
You could be working for 20, 30, 40 years for the same employer, and all they have to do is give you 2 weeks vacation. Now, I wouldn't consider that much motivation to stay around for 30 or 40 years. But what about 5, 10, 15, 20 years? 2 weeks vacation, Madam Speaker, that's it. Most provinces in this country, in Europe, and I'm sure in Australia and in Japan, though I haven't looked, but I'm pretty sure, Madam Speaker, in those places you get more vacation time. We see it in our own civil service. We provide in our own civil service collective bargaining agreement, Madam Speaker, the opportunity that when you have worked for a certain period of time, you get more vacation. 3 weeks vacation after 5 years, I think it is. 4 weeks vacation after 10, and I think it's 5 weeks vacation after 15. I'm not sure, but it goes up. And of course, that's a motivation to stay around. I'll work for you, and I know I'm going to get more vacation time. It actually makes good business sense. It actually makes good business sense to be able to do that. And Madam Speaker, we don't have it in this province. And we need to provide for incremental increases in vacation so workers in this province know if they're not unionized, they're going to have the right to get some vacation time. More than 2 weeks, 3 weeks after a certain period of time, 4 weeks after a certain period of time. Again, this is not going out on a limb. This is not revolutionary legislation. This is something almost every province in this country has and most of the industrialized world has. Brings us into the 20th century, quite frankly, Madam Speaker. even though we're in the 21st. I mentioned earlier about the 48-hour work week versus the 40-hour work week. You know, in France, they've moved to a 35-hour work week. And I remember at the time reading in The Economist, and I'm sure the government house leader, who's also a fan of that magazine, probably read that it was condemned. It was seen as going to destroy their economy. You know what? I think I've read more recently that the standard of living in France has increased dramatically in the past 5 years since they passed that legislation. I will note that there is, in the last 8 years, there has been a conservative, a relatively conservative, by French standards, president. In the last 3 or 4 years, 2 years, there has been a conservative government in Parliament, and they haven't revoked it. They haven't removed the 35-hour work week. They've kept it in. So clearly, if they thought it was so bad for business, they would have just repealed it and gone back to 40 or whatever. But the fact is that it's actually worked well for them. It's worked well in France. And one of the things I think as a parliament, as a legislature, we must begin to balance, Madam Speaker, is the fact, and we hear this on the doorsteps during elections, and we sort of chalk it up to, well, what can I do? There are things we can do. We hear from families. You know what? I'm working longer hours. That's what we hear from our constituents. My wife or my husband are working longer hours. We have to put our children in daycare just so we can pay for the house and pay for the clothes and pay for the food. We have to work weekends. I'm checking emails. I'm checking my cell phone. I'm checking answering machines all the time. We do it in this job. We know that. People expect it. But in most jobs, people are expected to do it. They're expected to work split shifts. They're expected to work odd hours. Where's the family come in that? Where's the opportunity for people to spend time with their family? Where's the opportunity? And let's be honest, some will say, well, that's what Sunday, why we don't need Sunday shopping. That gives you a chance to spend time with your Sunday. You know, the last time I heard, there's a lot of people that have to go into the offices on Sunday. They have to check their emails from home. They've got to respond. They've got to check their answering services. They have a cell phone with them, and so they're accessible 24/7. Well, Madam Speaker, we're in a state, we are in a situation where we hear from our constituents that they don't have time, you know, that their children are suffering because of it. We see children at risk because our families, and some will say, well, the children at risk are in places where people, you know, where they're not as well off, or their income isn't as great, or, you know, maybe they don't have a job. I would suggest to you there are many parts of our province, of our country, and in the world, in the industrialized world, where there are just as many children at risk, not because their parents are underemployed, or because their parents don't have a job, but because both parents are working, and their children don't have an opportunity to have two parents who are there for them. But can't we do something about that? Can't we begin to provide certain provisions? I'm not saying we're going to change the world, but we can provide some things. Here's another example. Well, first of all, as I said, we can drop to a 40-hour work week. Start working on the same pattern as the rest of the world. You know, we sometimes talk about the 40-hour work week as a given in the world. It hasn't been in Nova Scotia. It's a 48-hour work week. Yes, if you're unionized, you've probably negotiated something differently. In the civil service, I think it's 37 and a half hours. But if you're in the retail trade business, you have to work 48 hours. If they tell you to work 48 hours, you have no choice. But you know, particularly since Hurricane 1, this has sort of struck me. Because in my case, my son is still out of school because he goes to Tallahassee Community School, and it doesn't open, we don't have split shifting until Wednesday. But, you know, I happen to have a flexible boss. Thank you very much. I happen to have a wife with a flexible boss. I'll thank him for the record as well. But there are a lot of people out there who don't. And if you're not in a unionized workplace, or you don't have a benevolent employer, in this last week while school is out, what did you do with your kids? How did you look after them? In theory, if you had to go to work starting Wednesday, because I'll give credit for Monday and Tuesday being days where we were told to stay home. If you went to work on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, maybe you both had to work. What happened to the kids? Now, we all scrambled. We probably all found something, but that isn't the way it should be. We would like to see, in this Labor Standards Code, parental leave. Not only parental leave, but those situations where we may have parents, elderly parents, who need help. They may be living with us. They may have doctor's appointments. They may be sick. We may have children who are sick. We may have incidences that prevent us from being able to go to work because of familial responsibilities. And as a result, Madam Speaker, we'd like to see something in here that will provide for at least a few days so people can take those off in order to ensure, without pay, that they would have a certain right to be able to go and deal with those things. We don't have that. Now, I'll grant you, most provinces don't. I know Quebec has moved in that direction. But wouldn't it be nice for once if this province actually brought forward reasonable, progressive legislation. Seems the only time this province gets on the map for legislation is things like Michelin and other things. Legislation that seems to go against the trends of providing workers with rights. Madam Speaker, here's an opportunity under this Labour Standards Code to look at more than just Sunday shopping and look at other things as well, like a parental leave, a family leave time without pay. They have it in the United States, by the way, and none of us would argue that they're more progressive with regard to labor laws than us, yet they have it. And by the way, they also have a higher minimum wage in the United States. May I just ask how much time I have left, Madam Speaker? Thank you. The other issue that comes up around this is part-timers and benefits, Madam Speaker, because a lot of part-timers, and let's face it, we're moving to, in the last 10 years, to a workforce that involves more part-time work. We see people who have 2 or 3 part-time jobs instead of 1 full-time job. One of the benefits of that, pardon the pun, is that employers don't have to pay benefits to their workers. By having part-time workers, you save a lot on benefits. You don't have to provide them with health insurance or dental insurance or long-term disability insurance or sick day, short-term disability insurance. Those kind of things may not have to be provided. And in return, you get a worker who doesn't have, as they would say, those administrative costs or those extra costs that would result in the cost of per worker going. So instead of having 1 full-time worker, let's say that's $30,000 a year plus the benefits you pay, maybe it's 35 or whatever thousand. You have 2 part-time workers at $15,000. You don't have to provide the benefits. Saves the company $5,000. Hey, that's what business is about. I understand that. But our job is to make sure that we have a balance between the rights of the employers to make money and the rights of workers to have a life. That our province is not here. We don't live in this province to work. We work in this province to live. And that's something we have to begin to define Nova Scotia as. We have a great quality of life here. We have beautiful landscape. We have great communities. But if we keep ensuring that our Labour Standards Code is the worst in Canada, one of the worst in the industrialized world, then we will result, Madam Speaker, in the bad employers coming here, and we're going to reduce the quality of life. If we really want to succeed, we really want to prosper. Ontario didn't prosper by having bad labor standards legislation. And I know, I used to enforce the Employment Standards Code there before moving back here. It's changed now. The Harris government, the Eves government gutted their Employment Standards Code, and, well, look what happened to them, I can say. So, but, Madam Speaker, the fact is that you don't make a prosperous society on the backs of the workers. You don't make a prosperous society by allowing employers to come in here and have 48-hour work weeks, no real overtime provisions, bad vacation provisions, a weak minimum wage, one of the lowest in the world. Madam Speaker, that doesn't get you a prosperous society. It may get you McJobs, as my colleague from Halifax Needham said. It may get you cheap retail jobs, but it doesn't get you, Madam Speaker, it doesn't get us as a province prosperity. It doesn't move us from being a have-not province to a have province. What gets us there is having strong legislation, certain rights that balance the right of employers to make money with the right of workers to have a living wage with benefits. And what you get from that is a distribution, an equilibrium. Employers make money, workers get their fair share of the wealth from the work that they do, and in return, they spend more money back in the stores of those employers. They buy bigger cars, they buy bigger houses, they buy more toys, they buy more things for their homes because they have more money in their pockets. Employers, the ones higher up, put a lot of their more money in savings. So every $5,000 they save because they have 2 part-time workers compared to 1 full-time worker is money that they'll probably invest somewhere else. Indonesia, Cayman Islands, Monaco. But if you took that, if you had 1 full-time worker instead of 2 part-time workers, that extra $5,000 is being invested in the community and will be spent on things in the community. And that balance, that equilibrium, is what creates a society that can be prosperous. That's what makes Ontario more prosperous than Nova Scotia. It's what makes British Columbia more prosperous than Nova Scotia. It's what makes France, Germany, Scandinavia more prosperous than Nova Scotia. Because they found that equilibrium. They found that balance between the rights of employers to make money and the rights of employees to have minimum standards, labor standards that ensure that they can earn a decent living wage. We don't have that. in Nova Scotia. And until we do, we will continue to be a have-not province. We will continue to have people leaving this province. Madam Speaker, there's much more we can talk about around the Labour Standards Code, but there needs to be some understanding that in this province, Labour standards is not just about making some amendments to reflect in employment insurance changes federally, or changes that ensure that Sunday shopping can be allowed for businesses. It has to be bigger than that. We haven't had wholesale changes to our Labour Standards Code in at least 30 years. I don't think there's a member of this House who was sitting the last time we passed the full changes to the Labour Standards Code. And I look at the government House Leader at that time, because I believe it was before his time that we passed a Labour Standards Code. One of the other things that's important, I mentioned the minimum wage and said we have one of the lowest minimum wages in the industrialized world, lower than the United States. I was actually talking to someone earlier that up until recently, the United Kingdom didn't have a minimum wage, a national minimum wage. They only passed something, I think, in the last few years, which I always thought was quite interesting. I assumed that of all places, the United Kingdom would have a minimum wage. They didn't, but they do now. And they do now, and I don't know exactly what it is, but they do have a minimum wage. But in the United States, even in the last few years, I think 10 years ago, the United States had a federal national minimum wage of like $3.35. And now it's up to over $6. So they've quickly ramped their minimum wage up well beyond ours. And I think it's important, because right now as it stands, Madam Speaker, the way we do minimum wage is that every year the minister has to do a review, and Cabinet has to decide based on that review whether they're going to increase it. And this may sound shocking, and I don't want anyone to fall off their chair, but we find that the minimum wages go up just before elections, Madam Speaker. I don't want to be cynical, but it seems that just before elections, and the member from Cape Breton West would know because he was raising it as the Minister of Labour before in 1999. And I believe the minister, maybe the government House Leader was the minister at the time, last year announced, earlier this year or last year, announced an increase in the minimum wage. For all I know, it may have gone up 3 days ago, or 5 days ago on October 1st. The date is legislated, but whether we increase it or not, Madam Speaker, depends on whether a cabinet thinks it's the appropriate thing to do with 6 months' notice. So the fact is, though, that it always seems to be just before an election we seem to get the increase in the minimum wage. So that when they go to their doorsteps, the government MLAs can say, we raised the minimum wage, 10 cents an hour.
He said have more elections.
Yes, well, I guess with the minority government situation, we probably are going to have more elections, Madam Speaker. So I guess we're going to get more minimum wage increases. I expect one next, I guess it'll be April 1st, we can expect our next minimum wage increase. So I hope so. But the fact is, Madam Speaker, that the minimum wage is so political. It's become so political that we have ministers who recommend only, and cabinets only approve around elections. Wouldn't it be nice to have a system in which we would allow people who aren't directly politically involved to provide advice to the government and allow them to make a decision as to what the minimum wage should be? It can be done. You know, in many cases in the past 30 years, we've torn apart the labor management relationship in this province. I don't mean in a workplace by workplace basis, but as a Nova Scotia, as a province, we have. And Madam Speaker, it's time we start rebuilding it. We're rebuilding it on an Occupational Health and Safety Advisory Council. Why not rebuild it with regard to Labour Standards Code as well, with regard to minimum wage? That would ensure that Nova Scotians would have, and employers and employees could begin to talk to each other about the things that they need. Let them make the compromises. They make them every day in the workplace. They make them every day at an Occupational Health and Safety Advisory Council. They know how to negotiate in the workplace. Let them do that. Let them sit down and decide what they think the minimum wage should be for the next year. Let them provide advice to the government. It can be done. It's not radical. We already do it in other areas. Why not in this area as well? These are the things we need in a Labour Standards Code that aren't being looked at by this government. We need a Labour Standards Code that comes in to the 20th century.
20th, 21st.
Well, we're in the 21st, but we have a Labour Standards Code that, quite frankly, is mired in the early part of the 20th century. And in the 1970s, we may have entrenched it, but the fact is, Madam Speaker, that in Nova Scotia, it's time that we begin to realize that we are all better off when we have a better Labour Standards Code. And that is why we need more in this legislation than just Sunday shopping. And we must ensure that Nova Scotians are protected on Sundays, but also protected the other 6 days of the week as well. Thank you.
All right.
The honourable member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and make a few comments with regards to Bill 2, an act to amend Chapter 402 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Retail Business Uniform Closing Day Act, and Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Labour Standards Code. At the outset, Madam Speaker, I want to concur with many of the comments that were made by my colleague from Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage. From Eastern Passage, yes. Because as many may or may not know, he has a labor background. He was a workers' advisor with the Workers' Advisor Program with the Nova Scotia Department of Labor at that time, and now is the Department of Environment and Labor. So he does have some real experience in that particular department. And although I didn't always agree with some of the approaches and positions he took, I must say that he has a very knowledgeable and strong background and a working knowledge, particularly since he went through the process at or about the time when the Occupational Health and Safety Act was being amended. So he does bring some real live experience to the table, and I think that's very important, particularly since we're dealing with some possible amendments to the Labour Standards Code. Madam Speaker, this appears to be one of these issues that you have to think or believe that you have a position one day, and the next day you're scratching your head and saying, well, do I really agree with this legislation or do I not? But it's only upon reflection, when you see all the changes that have taken place over the last 20 to 30 years here in Nova Scotia, that you come to realize how all our positions have changed quite dramatically, and our attitudes, whether it be on a social, an economic, a cultural, or a religious perspective, or any other perspective for that matter. It's interesting to note, because of all the changes in society over the last 20 to 30 years, I believe that it's in part why this piece of legislation is before us here today. For example, if you look back in time, some 20 years ago, it's interesting to note the number of single-parent families, how much that number has increased from 20 years ago. If you look even back some, let's say, 12 years ago, at one time we had the total number of single families in 1991 was slightly more than 33,000, whereas just a little more than a year ago, that number was up to over 44,000. So we can see, Madam Speaker, the number of single parent families is increasing. And obviously that has an impact on the family's ability to generate sufficient monies to be able to pay their day-to-day bills. And for the most part, most single parent families are ones that I would suggest are at or near the poverty level. If you take the total number, if you took, for example, a family of four. 5 years ago, I believe, for a family of four, that could very well be a mother with 3 children, or it could be a single dad with 3 children, or it could be a couple with 2 children. But the poverty level at that time, 5 years ago, was approximately $24,500. Now, if you take a single parent family in particular, there aren't too many single parent families that make a significant amount of money above that. And the figures will bear that out, because for the most part, most single parent families have the sole breadwinner, if you could use that term, or income earner is female. And we know the disparity in the wage situation between male and female in the marketplace. It's been documented. That's why we have the Pay Equity Commission. That's why we have all these different factors that we try to inject into the process to balance the scale. But notwithstanding all these various factors, Madam Speaker, we are still faced with the reality that many single-parent families want to find as much time to work as possible. And yes, in many cases, that means working on holidays and indeed on Sundays. And another factor as well, Madam Speaker, is the fact that many single parent families don't receive or enjoy the same benefits level as someone where you have two income levels or two incomes in one family. Because although one of the two in a two-income family may have full benefits or the other one doesn't have as much, at least that cushion is there. For example, if you had two professional types, let's say a school teacher and a nurse in a family, both may have the opportunity, if they're full-time employees, to enjoy the benefits of being able to sign on to a medical plan, a dental plan, a sick plan, any type of a plan where it would reduce the cost of prescription drugs, that sort of thing. In a single-parent family, that's not always the case. So these are some of the factors that have gone into this equation, although we don't seem to look at that at first glance. We say, well, this is a global economy, and this is the way things are going, and if we have to be competitive, we have to change our laws to be competitive, whether it be with the businesses in New Brunswick or the fact that many Nova Scotians more and more are traveling south of the border to do their Christmas shopping. They may make it a long weekend excursion, perhaps in mid-October or November, and it's an escape weekend, and they tack on an extra day. And so it doesn't take long for them to spend all the dollars that normally they would have spent in the province. So that's another factor into the equation on this particular piece of legislation. But before I dwell too deeply into the contemporary aspects of this particular legislation, another interesting point about the way things have changed in Nova Scotia over the past 30 years, and I know we have so at least one individual of a certain degree of expertise in the legislative chamber, and that's with regards to our disposition in terms of our partaking in religious activities on holy days, whether it be Sunday or certain festive or particular set days in the calendar year for commemorating or remembering certain activities, whether it be in the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, United, Jewish, or what have you. The fact of the matter is, the point I'm about to make, Madam Speaker, is that there are less and less Nova Scotians today that partake in the conventional sense of church activities. That doesn't make them less of a Christian, not in any sense of the word. But if you look back 30 years ago, the estimates are that nearly 70% of all Nova Scotians would attend some type of a religious service on a regular basis, perhaps a weekly basis, in one form or the other. Whereas today, that's only about 35%. So that does have an impact. It does have an impact on our attitudes, our dispositions about certain conventions that we always knew to be true to form. Particularly, I'll give you an example, Madam Speaker. When I first started school, and some would say that was a long time ago, some would say it was not all that long ago, but it was a regular thing that, first of all, you would say your morning prayers. Well, we all know what's transpired over the years on that particular issue. And at one time as well, perhaps not on a regular basis, but quite often, we would also sing the national anthem. Well, I don't hear that being spoken of by children that often as it once was when I went to school. So there are a lot of conventions that have changed in society, and the way we teach our children, the way we view society in general, our community, our municipality, our province, our country. Things are changing. And that's not just locally, but that's at the national level and international level. So you put all these factors in. Again, that's another contributing issue, I believe, in part, to why we're dealing with this particular piece of legislation and the amendments to the Labor Standards Code. Madam Speaker, we also see that the cost of living for the average family today has escalated, or even if you would like to, I could certainly quote lots of figures, Madam Speaker, going back some 20, 30 years, but I think it would be safe to say that the consumer price index has increased almost 2 to 3 times as much as the income levels for the average family in Nova Scotia. So again, we see the need to have not just one income earner in the family. Well, it may be a silly argument, but there's a need for more revenue to pay more bills. The cost of electricity has gone up. The cost of oil has gone up. The cost of our telephone bills have gone up. Well, Madam Speaker, I would perfectly submit that the honourable member for Dartmouth North will have ample opportunity to present his arguments. And if I'm not going to be able to present all the different factors that go into this, so that we can come to a rational, reasoned conclusion as to what's the best form of legislation to adopt, well, then we might as well stop all debates at this point. So I haven't come to any conclusions any more than any other member in this House. So I would ask the honourable member to at least consider these important factors, because for the everyday working family, when the cost of your telephone bill goes up, I know our family just received a notice recently from Alliant Telephone that electrical surcharges, or the service charge, the monthly charge, that's gone up. We recently received a notice from the power company. The electrical bill has gone up. Oil costs have gone up. Property taxes have gone up. Personal income taxes have gone up, despite well, they have. When you add up the user fees, all these hidden fees on licensing fees, on insurance fees, you name it, Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is the average income has less disposable income to look after his or her or their family. And that's the reality. And that is a driving factor, whether we like to admit it or not. Should that be the only factor? No. I agree with the member for Dartmouth North. I do not agree that this should be a motivating factor to move. But it's one of the realisms that we have to deal with. As well, Madam Speaker, if well, let's go back and look in time. This is not something that just came before the House this year. Let's go back to 1986. 1986, when the then Minister of Justice, or then Minister, or the Attorney General, the Honourable Ron Giffen, amended the legislation. I believe it was called Bill 70, an act to amend the operation of retail businesses, Holidays Act, and also amending legislation to deal with a number of other issues. Well, Madam Speaker, that was because of a Supreme Court decision that was to deal with the issue of religious conventions and rights, and that was out of a Supreme Court decision out of Halifax, or out of the province of Alberta. So, and then it had the domino theory. So, ultimately, without getting into a lot of details, there had to be some refinement and adjustment to the Lord's Day Act. And then, lo and behold, back in 1993, that was amended even further by previous government to make provision for the allowance of shopping, Sunday shopping.
Order, please. The honourable member from Cape Breton West has the floor. Hope that everybody could listen to the debate, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm sure those who don't catch it will certainly be willing to read it on a future day. But in 1993, the Act was amended again to make provision for shopping during the Christmas period. Now, I listened to the dissertation from the leader of the NDP party, and it's amazing. It's amazing how, well, 2003, 17 years later, almost verbatim, Madam Speaker, the words have come back to be echoed by the honourable member who is the leader of the NDP party. At that time, it was 1985 actually, yes, the leader of the NDP party at that time made almost the same comments as what was made here. Rather than come down and make a conclusive position as to where she stood, much the same as what we heard here this evening, what the leader of the opposition said today was that Sunday shopping is inevitable. Well, let me quote what the leader of the NDP said on April 30th, 1985. I think that this is an inevitable development. Well, that's pretty profound. It's inevitable that I'm going to die someday. But what am I going to do? Sit here and do nothing for hopefully for quite a while? I'll be around. I mean, that's a rather fundamentalist position to have. The fact of the matter is, Madam Speaker, he says nothing. And I am kind of capturing the words of one of my colleagues when I use that reference to, it's inevitable that we're all going to die, as my colleague from Richmond once indicated. But what are we going to do? Are we going to do nothing on issues like this? I mean, it can't be. So really what he's trying to say is that he wants to be on both sides of the issue at the same time. During her position on that particular piece of legislation, Madam Speaker, by golly, she, like her colleague from Sackville-Cobequid, he was in favor of Sunday shopping. He was in favor of Sunday shopping, and he chastised members of the Liberal government at the time for their position. But yet, when the vote was taken, and it's on record here on page 2487, Monday, November 15, 1993, they both opposed it. So on one hand, they go in their speeches, they support the principle of Sunday shopping, but when the vote was taken, they vote against it. So you can't be on both sides of this issue at the same time. Either you're for it or you're against it. But this is a general theme. This is a general theme. So, Madam Speaker, that's why I put all these other issues on the table, because it is a complex issue. It's not an easy issue. And the issue of labor standards. If anything the government should be doing, Madam Speaker, it should be dealing with the problems within the Department of Environment and Labor. The latest reports I received from senior staff in the Department of Environment and Labor is that there's a 22-month backlog on complaints at the Labor Standards Division in that department. Why isn't the government putting more resources to help all these people that have complaints and have their wages are being held up by employers who are not such good, honorable employers? Now, that's not all. There's some. But we have 2,200 complaints in there in a backlog. Or no, we have about 2,000 over a 22-month period. Now, why hasn't that backlog been cleared up after nearly 2 years? After nearly 2 years. If the government wants to do anything to help the workers in Nova Scotia, put the resources in the department to help them. I mean, it's absolutely disgraceful that they're so short-handed in that department. And not only that, but if we were to deal with this backlog, if we were to deal with this backlog of 2,200, perhaps we'd be able to find some possible solutions to the process, to the Labor Standards Code, to some ways that we may be able to improve this legislation, Madam Speaker. So if anything the government wants to do, it's there before them, if they only want to put their mind to it. Madam Speaker, the issue of workers' rights is one that I think has to be examined. I believe that the Occupational Health and Safety Act that was adopted under the previous Liberal administration was a good piece of legislation. But as has been noted earlier, there are some problems with the workings of that. And for those that aren't familiar with this particular piece of legislation, I'll try and give a snapshot as I know. If you, Madam Speaker, you're working in your workplace and you have a complaint with your employer, if you're less than 25 employees or even less than 5, okay, there are certain processes that kick into place. If you have over 25, you have the labor management, occupational health and safety panels or working committees, and they generally meet once a month. And then it's kind of like a round table discussion, and intermittently the Department of Labor would partake and review the monthly reports. It's almost a requirement, a prescription by law. Now, for those that work, if you were working in an environment where there's maybe only 3 employees, and you had a lot of problems in there, and you felt, look, I'm being harassed in the workplace, and it's just too untenable for me to go to work anymore, but you really can't quantify, you can't put in substantive numbers and form that how you're being harassed, but you know that if you go there, it's not a healthy environment to be there. You have the right under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, if you genuinely and truly believe that it is to your detriment to go to work, then you can refuse to go to that place of environment. Now, what did this government do several years ago? They brought in a sunset clause for the occupational health and safety regulations. They really haven't come back into full form, and a lot of other regulations. The honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley says we're misleading the House. Well, I would submit, Madam Speaker, that there's sufficient evidence to show why there are less and less workers feeling comfortable with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. There's sufficient evidence. And if the honourable member would like to take up the challenge on that in a debate on a future day, I'll certainly provide him with lots of evidence, which is perhaps why one of his own caucus colleagues on a previous day introduced a piece of legislation even to exempt parts of the the Occupational Health and Safety Act from being enforced. And that was introduced by the member for Digby Annapolis. And I believe that the government House Leader would certainly remember that piece of legislation. So this government does not have a good track record when it comes to occupational health and safety for workers in Nova Scotia. I don't want to go back into the annals of history on and in and around the West Ray. I mean, we've all learned one way or the other from that. But the fact of the matter is, increasingly, more and more employees, workers in this province, do not have a comfort level with the Occupational Health and Safety Act like they once did. They don't, because when they see CEOs of large corporations going and having a private meeting with a minister to lobby against certain changes to the workers or the occupational health and safety regulations. For example, Madam Speaker, when the regulations were changed so that Nova Scotia Power would only require sending one linesman out on an emergency call or any service call. Pardon? Well, they can today. They certainly can. Those regulations were amended under that government. Under that government, and that member doesn't seem to know what his own government does. That was an issue that we raised in question period on a previous day. That was an issue that we raised in opposition debate. And this member doesn't even seem to know that the workers' rights at Nova Scotia Power have been somewhat compromised. They certainly have. If somebody goes out and gets zapped on a power line, 25,000 volts, the argument of saying, well, he's got a cell phone with him, he can call in for help. Now, if somebody gets 25,000 volts going through them, or they fall 75 feet off a pole, you think they're going to be in much shape to be making a phone call to head office for a backup? I don't think so, Madam Speaker. So this is why I'm glad to see this issue of Labour Standards Code brought into. So perhaps the honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid or Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley would in fact take time to read those regulations. Well, Madam Speaker, there appears to be a little bit of jest around this serious issue, but the fact of the matter is, if there's a second person there, perhaps that second person could alert the first person that he or she is in a position of danger. Before it happens, you know, not the typical conservative philosophy that, oh, well, you're only a number, and if anything happens, well, we'll go get somebody else. You know, this is all about protecting workers' rights. And yes, it does speak to this legislation. And I would invite, Madam Speaker, I would invite some of these members that seem to be chomping at the bit to get up and defend this piece of legislation to do so and to give us some of their thoughts and their reasons for supporting this legislation. And I'm certain it would encourage members of the opposition to take notice that perhaps there are certain aspects of this legislation that we've overlooked or that we'd be willing to adapt to. So, Madam Speaker, there is sufficient argument as to why the government should examine the issue of workers' rights on this particular piece of legislation. I'm also interested, Mr. Speaker, welcome back to the chair. Now I know for sure I will be brought back, reined back into onto the proper course. But another interesting issue that came to light just recently, and it has profound implications on this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, is that recent Supreme Court decision that we read about in the newspapers on weekend past. I was a bit taken back by it, to be honest, because the legislation that was crafted in 1999 was crafted in large measure to deal with the Supreme Court decision of 1996. And all stakeholders, I believe at the time, there were equivalent of at least 12 legal minds from in total between Workers' Compensation Board, the Workers' Advisors Program, the Department of Environment and Labor, Department of Justice, representatives from all different stakeholders, Mr. Speaker, that tried to deal with that issue on chronic pain as diligently as possibly could. And it was certainly well debated here before the House. So it was supported by that Supreme Court decision. So that's why it came into being. And now we have the Supreme Court justices reversing their own decision. So it begs you to wonder, what are going to be the implications of this legislation? When we adopt this legislation, is there going to be a Supreme Court decision come down and say this is unconstitutional or that's unconstitutional? I mean, what are we as legislators to think? I mean, the bigger question is, where is the line in the sand, or where is that line of jurisdiction between Parliament and the Supreme Court? Something has to be done. We can't be going back and forth and tossing the injured workers of this province as if they're in a roller coaster. We can't, and it's not just those with the workers' compensation system. What about those applying for Canada Pension? What about those who are applying for compensation or some type of justice, whether it be through the Human Rights Commission or what have you, Mr. Speaker? Well, it is. It ties into the second component of the Bill number 2, which deals with labor standards. And unless we have those labor standards clearly defined to be able to protect the rights of workers, we're going to have more and more court cases such as what we've just witnessed. What we've just seen, Mr. Speaker, is a culmination of, 4 years? 4 years of being kicked around in the system. Is it fair to the injured workers? No, it's not. Is it fair to the employers of this province? No, it's not. Because the bills have to be paid, and there's no-fault insurance system. So it all ties together. So the government does have an opportunity to do something here, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not so sure the government has really fully addressed all these aspects. Now, the issue of Sunday shopping, I must say that depending upon who you talk to, if you were to question people today, I know the government has done some polling on Sunday shopping. I know certainly if you were in Cumberland County, there'd be a very strong percentage of individuals, I would suspect, that would support Sunday shopping, at least in the business community. I somehow suspect the Minister of Development, Economic Development, might be on that side of the equation. But if you were to go to North Sydney, for example, the Cape Breton North, I strongly suspect a large number of the constituents and the Minister for Energy would be opposed to Sunday shopping. And I base that not on any specific data per se, but on the large number of petitions that came from Cape Breton North at the time the casino legislation was introduced before this House. I must say, I received more calls from Cape Breton North than I did from my own riding during that particular piece of legislation. So I would strongly suspect that it would be pretty much the same parallel on Sunday shopping. And so the minister seems to be nodding yes. So I would be quite interested to find out his perceptions and thoughts on this particular piece of legislation. Maybe it's an opportunity for the government to call for a free vote, and we'll find out where the minister from Cape Breton North really stands on this issue, Mr. Speaker. Now, if you were to go down, I'm sure if you go down into the valley area, again too, there would be Annapolis. I'm sure that the member for Annapolis North would, I do apologize, Kings North, would be very much opposed to Sunday shopping. I would think, based on his convictions and the constituency that he represents. Very traditional, conservative, small C. Well, presently, big C. And, but I think the point is